If you're not sure where to start with collaging in your art journal and you want to create some really textured, interesting, layered pieces that pop off the page, then I'm going to share some of my top tips for layering and collaging in your art journal. It's easier than you think. It might take a bit of practice, but I'm going to share 3 top tips that I use when I am creating every single one of my journal pages. And if you're new here, hey, my name is Meg. I create videos all about art journaling, creativity, and everything in between. So grab a cup of tea and join me whilst we discuss collaging in our art journals. So the book I'm using here is actually an altered book. So this is an old book that I am repurposing to create some art in. You do need to remove some pages so that you don't end up with a super chunky book. But if you're looking to get into collaging, I would definitely recommend potentially doing it this way, because you can pick up an old book from, secondhand shop, charity shop. This only cost me a couple of pounds, and there are so many pages that I can use. So not only the pages that are left inside the book that I'm working on, but as you'll see, the pages that I'm ripping out, I can also use them within my collage materials. And I could create a whole separate video about all of the different papers and materials that you can use and pick up to add to your collages, but I just wanted to say before we get started that you don't need loads of things in order to start practicing and working on collages in your art journals. So my first tip for effective layering is to incorporate texture. I love to add texture because it adds depth, it adds interest, and you can use so many different materials and techniques in order to achieve different results. So good things for this are crumpled brown paper that you have in packaging, or tissue paper that you layer on top of different papers. There's textured paper, there's fabric, you could even use embroidery thread to add tactile elements to your pages. There's stenciling, stamping, embossing, you get the idea. The list goes on with the different ways that you can add texture, and I think this is a really fun way to add interest to your collages so that they don't feel as flat and one-dimensional, because it can really lift things on your pages and add the extra detail that you might be looking for. And of course, it's not something that you have to include across all of your page as well. It might be one small section, so in like a corner or along the side, that you overlap some of these textural elements, and visually it just creates a little bit of difference, that maybe your eye is drawn to a certain section, or it highlights something, or it's maybe a focal point, and you start building your focal point around that. Because whenever I'm thinking of collages, there's sort of 3 main aspects. So you've got your background layer, your middle ground, and your foreground. So there's different ways that you can add texture to each of those, and you might use different materials for that. So for example, with the background layer, I would use elements that are larger and that I'm not too worried about them getting covered up necessarily by other bits of collage that I'm adding on top, but I'd probably go for things that are more subtle. So this might be where you use your tissue paper, but not as textural. I tend to work, the closer you get to the foreground, you can start adding more texture, just because it makes it harder to work on top of, if that makes sense. So if you've gone for something like all this really crumpled paper, it can sometimes then be hard when it comes to adding glue on top or using other elements on top of that. So it's just something to bear in mind when you are adding texture, to be mindful about the other elements that you then want to come and add on top of that, because you might have a bit of a bumpy surface to work on. So it's just something to bear in mind when you're thinking about the different ways that you want to arrange the elements on your page. But I would definitely recommend that you experiment with different textures to see what works best for you and your style, and the result that you want to get out of the page as well. So incorporating texture will definitely make your collage a lot more visually interesting, and it's definitely one of my favorite ways to add some interest to my pages. Now, for my second tip, I'm going to kind of go a bit opposite here and say that negative space is your friend. So you don't have to cover every single inch of your page with collage if you don't want to, and sometimes it can actually be a beneficial thing to add to your page by not adding something. So it's a way that empty space can create balance, and it can almost work as contrast in times, because you're not overloading the page with all the different elements on the page. So you can see here I've worked sort of concentrated on the center, but I've left gaps and room to breathe in some of the corners, so I've not come in and added things in every single inch. Now, don't get me wrong, I love to do collage clusters and layering up all the different things, but there's definitely a place for having nothing on the page, and the way that that allows you to work with the composition or to make the page more interesting. So you might want to work just up one side and leave the side on the opposite blank, or you might want to concentrate your collage, say, in the center of the page and leave your room to breathe around the outside, and this can just help with the balance that you're creating on your page. So leaving these areas behind and leaving them untouched can create balance for your page. And if you're struggling with using collage elements, so for example like book pages that are very visually, there's a lot going on there, something that I like to do, as you can see here, is I'm using white acrylic paint to not only blend in my different scraps here to the page, but as you can see, it pushes some of the elements back. So if there's busyness, you can subdue it, and it doesn't completely cover up what you've added to the page, but it just pushes it back and adds a little bit more breathing room that is perhaps a bit more interesting. So rather than just leaving a completely white space or blank section of your page, you can have things be pushed back, and just working with that balance that you can create on your page. I really love the softness that it adds to my collages, and also it's fun to work with the mixed media element of this as well by adding paint. I also like to add coffee staining too. That's a really fun way to play with different sort of gradients and the way that the coffee will dry on the page. For example, you might have darker areas and lighter areas, and it really just brings a whole extra level to your collages as you're working on them. So I'd really encourage you to think about negative space and how the areas where you don't add anything can actually highlight the areas that you do add something to the page. And I think one of the best things about incorporating negative space into your collages is that it can help you to not feel so overwhelmed and your page to feel so cluttered. So if sometimes you feel like there's a lot going on and there's no focal point, sometimes negative space can help you to create that. So you leave some areas blank and you give your eyes a place to rest on the page, and you don't feel as overwhelmed by all of the different things going on, the clashing patterns and all the different colors, and your eye is then instead drawn to the areas where you're creating focus. So you can see now that I have subdued some of the areas of this page, when I'm coming in with my text and also some pink card here underneath, I'm able to draw focus to the areas that I want to be the center of my page. And even though there's a lot going on here, because I've been able to work with that negative space, you can see how I've been able to have sort of two central places here on either side of the page, even though there is some stamping and all this different interest going on in the texture. I think it helps just to balance the page. So it's definitely something that I'd recommend if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by your collages. And my final tip for you with collaging is to play around with the different materials that you can use. So there's so many different papers and materials that can be used for layering. So tissue paper, paint, stamps, you can go really mixed media with this if you want, or you can use washi tapes, you can use junk mail and found papers. You'll see in my journals all the time I'm using bits of recycled packaging and things that I find. The piece of pink card there wasn't something I went out and bought, as you'll have seen. It was just from a brochure that I decided, do you know what, that's a really nice shade of pink, let me include that within my journaling. And you wouldn't know that it was from that, but it's just really good to be able to reuse some of these things. And I think that once you start thinking about the papers that you see in everyday life in this way, you'll soon find yourself collecting a whole heap of different things that you think, oh, maybe I could actually use that in my collaging, and the different areas of interest that you can find maybe in sections of a magazine or in different catalogues. There's so many different materials out there that you can use in collaging, and lots of them are free as well. You don't have to go out and buy lots of patterned papers and things. You could make your own papers with stamping and stenciling, and obviously then each one is completely unique as well, and you can use sections of things and tear bits up and create a mess if you want to, and it's just a really freeing way of creating in your art journal. At least for me, I love it for backgrounds, I love it for adding areas of interest. I'll collage on tags and envelopes and everything that I can get my hands on, so it's a really fun way to add patterns and colours to your journals. So I hope you found these tips useful and that you're able to go ahead and try some of them out within your own art journals. If you're worried about creating straight into your book, then you can always create on scrap pieces of paper outside of your journals. That's what I would always recommend if you're feeling a little bit nervous or you just want somewhere to play. You can create on a separate piece of paper and then include that as a collaged element, either in its entirety or just in little sections and strips. And as you can see, the page that I've been creating throughout this video has used all of these techniques in one way or another to create this collaged effect page. And if you'd like to see more process videos working in this altar book, then I recommend checking out this playlist here, or subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. Bye guys!